All right, part two. To build a fire, page 67. The frozen moistness of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost. The hair on the man's face was similarly frosted, but more solidly. It took the form of ice and increased with every warm, moist breath from his mouth. Also, the man had tobacco in his mouth. The ice held his lips so tightly together that he could not empty the juice from his mouth. The result was a long piece of yellow ice hanging from his lips. If he fell down, it would break, like glass, into many pieces. He expected the ice formed by the tobacco juice having been out twice before when it was very cold. But it had not been as cold as this, he knew. He continued through the level forest for several miles. Then he went down a bank to the frozen path of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew he was 10 miles from where the stream divided. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was traveling at the rate of 4 miles an hour. Thus he figured that he would arrive where the stream divided at 12:30. He decided he would eat his lunch when he arrived there. The dog followed at his heels, and with its tail hanging low as the man started to walk along the frozen path. The old sled trail could be seen, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last sleds. In a month, no man had traveled up or down that silent creek. The man was steadily ahead. He was not much of a thinker. At that moment, he had nothing to think about except that he would eat lunch at the stream's divide and that at about 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to. Had there been, speech would not have been possible because of the ice around his mouth. Once in a while, the thought repeated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did not He did this thinking frequently changing hands, but with all his rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face would surely be frozen. He knew that, and he was sorry that he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. Such a guard passed across the nose and covered the entire face. But it did not matter much, he decided. What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creek, the curves and the bends, and always he noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he moved suddenly to the side like a frightened horse. He curved away from the place where he had been walking and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek contained water in that winter, but he also knew that there were streams of water that came in from the hillside and that ran along under the snow and on top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather these streams were never frozen, and he also knew their danger. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be there inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when a man broke through he could get very wet. That was why he had jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet. He had also heard the noise of the snow-covered ice skin breaking, and to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bottom and its banks. He decided that the flowing stream of water came from the right side. He thought a while, rubbing his nose and face. Then he walked to the left. He stopped carefully and tested the ice at each step. Once away from the danger, he continued his 4 mile pace. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually the snow above the pools had a sunken appearance. However, once again he came near to falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. The dog did not want to go ahead. Did not want to go. It hesitated, and the man pushed it forward. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it fell through the ice, but climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet its feet and legs. Almost immediately, the water on them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off its legs. Then it lay down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. The animal knew enough to do this. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. But the man knew these things, having learned them from help experience. He removed the mitten from his right hand and helped the dog tear out the pieces of ice. And he did not bear his fingers more than a minute and was surprised to find out that they were numb. It certainly was cold. He pulled on the mitten quickly and beat the hands across his breast. At 12 o'clock the day was at its brightest. Yet the sun did not appear in the sky. At 12:30 on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek. He was pleased at his rate of speed. If he continued, he would certainly be with the boys by 6 o'clock that evening. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and pulled forth his lunch. The action took no more than a quarter of a minute. Yet in that brief moment, the numbness touched his bare fingers. He did not pull the mitten on, but instead struck the fingers against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The pain that followed the striking of his fingers against his legs ceased so quickly that he was frightened. He had not had time to take the bite of his lunch. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten. Then he bared the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten to build a fire and warm himself. He laughed at his own foolishness. As he laughed, he noted the numbness in his bare forefingers. Also, he noted that the feeling which had come first to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or whether they were numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was somewhat frightened. He stamped forcefully until the feeling returned to his feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in this country. And he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He walked a few steps, stamping his feet and waving his arms until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he took some matches and proceeded to make a fire. In the bushes, the high water had left a supply of sticks. From here he got wood for his fire. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire. Bending over the fire, he first melted the ice from his face. With the protection of the fire's warmth, he ate his lunch. For the moment, the cold had been forced away. The dog took comfort in the fire, lying at full length, close enough for warmth and far enough to escape being burned. When the man had finished eating, he filled his pipe with tobacco and had a comfortable time with a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled his cap firmly on about his ears, and started along the creek trail toward the left. The dog was sorry to leave and looked toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly none of his ancestors had known cold, real cold, but the dog knew, and all its family knew. And it knew that it was not good to walk outside in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie in a hole in the snow and wait for this awful cold to stop. There was no real bond between the dog and the man. The one was the slave to the other. The dog made no effort to indicate its fears to the man. It was not concerned with the well-being of the man. It was for its own sake that it looked toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of the whip in his voice. So the dog startled, walked closely to the man's heels, and followed him along the trail. The man put more tobacco in his mouth and started a new growth of yellow ice on his face. Again, his moist breath quickly powdered the hair on his face with white. He looked around him. There did not seem to be so many pools of water under the snow on the left side of the Henderson Creek, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At the place where there were no signs, the man broke through. It was not deep. He was wet to the knees before he got out of the water to the firm snow. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour. Now he would have to build a fire and dry his moccasins and socks. This was most important at that low temperature. He knew that much. So he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, under several small pine trees, he found some firewood which had been carried there by the high water of last year. There were some sticks, but also larger branches and some dry grasses. He threw several large branches on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from dying in the wet snow. He made a flame by touching a match to a small piece of tree bark, and he took from his pocket. This burned even better than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with pieces of dry grass and with the smallest dry sticks. He worked slowly and carefully, realizing his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the sticks with which he fed it. He sat in the snow, pulling the sticks from the bushes under the trees and feeding them directly to the flame. He knew he must not fail. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his attempt to build a fire. This is especially true if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile to keep his blood moving. But the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot be kept moving by running when it is 75 degrees below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze even harder. All this the man knew. The man on Sulphur Creek had told him about it, and now he was grateful for the advice. Already all feeling had gone from his feet. To build a fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly become numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pushing the blood to all parts of his body. But the instant he stopped, the action of the heart slowed down, and he now received the full force of the cold. The blood of his body drew back from it. The blood was alive like the dog. Like the dog, it wanted to hide and seek cover away from the fearful cold. As long as he walked 4 miles an hour, the blood rose to the surface, but now it sank down into the lowest depths of his body. His feet and hands were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze first, his bare fingers were numb, although they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and face were already freezing, while the skin of all of his body became cold as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and face would be only touched by the frost because the fire was beginning to warm with strength. He was feeding it with sticks the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with larger branches, and then he could remove his wet moccasins and socks. And while they dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them first with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. All right, what page are we on? 72. All right, we'll start back to 72. We'll finish this on Monday.